A very warm welcome to this webinar on law, justice and policing under the Myanmar military coup. I'm Helene Maria Gyd from DIIS, the Danish Institute for International Studies. I'm a senior researcher here, and I've done research on justice-related issues in Myanmar for quite a while. And I feel that DIIS and we are very lucky to be able to co-organize this webinar as part of the Tanaka International Webinar Series with Oxford University. And this series is run by Dr. Kin Marmaji, who's of course with us today. Dr. Kin Marmaji is a well-known anthropologist. She is at Oxford University, where she is a gender research fellow and also a film documenter. And she will be steering the webinar today. I will give her the words shortly. I just wanted to express that as a researcher who has worked on issues related to everyday justice for quite a while before the coup, I'm really excited to have this webinar on what Dr. Ma and I found a very topical and important issue, namely to discuss how notions and ideas about justice are unfolding currently under the coup in the resistance movement, but also how the military, as we have seen, is using the law, is using the justice system as part of its efforts to hold on to power, even to justify the coup and also to deal with those who opposed the coup. And finally, we are also very interested in discussing what happens with actors within the security forces, within the police, within the justice sector. We've seen some defections from the police, but what are actually the prospects? What's going on amongst the actors who are part of the police and the justice sector? So we believed that these are important issues to discuss, of course, to trying to understand what's going on right now, but also in discussing what can happen in the future, aspirations for justice in the future past the military coup. And with those words, I want to give the floor to Dr. Kin Marmaji, and thank you for organizing this with us and for encouraging me also to be part of the series.
Good day, everybody, and thank you so much for being here. And I am thrilled to have this panel in terms of subject matter, and it is really important. The most important issues that Burma face, but also the speakers. I have known them for many years, and we're doing a wonderful job. And I'm very grateful for your participation. But Dr. Helena has been also playing a huge role inside Myanmar, and particularly working with the transitional justice. And she is not only working as a scholarly way, but also physically, practically helping Burmese. And I'm very grateful to her and having a chance to organize together this panel. So here today is very important seminar that we have to learn. We can learn from the experts on Myanmar issue, and these expert scholars are not only expert in their discipline, but also passionate about Myanmar. And Myanmar law and justice is like one example. I can say that 19 young protesters are sentenced to death for killing one police soldiers. It is despite the fact that there's no evidence, no witness, and yet 19 of them are sentenced to death. But also, there are at the moment more than 800 people have been killed, and we have 200,000 of evidence. But so far it's like no one is being accountable for. And then the today panel is also very important, and because of the issue, like the law is in Myanmar, law has been used and manipulated to oppress people. But also Myanmar law is already complicated because it is like unique combination of foreign law, outdated foreign law of the British 19th century for India and applying to Myanmar, but also customary law that Helena is expert on, and also recent legislation, February 16, about 505A. So I think it's really so many things that we have to learn and from this panel, and thank you so much for joining with us. And the first person that I'd like to introduce you as speakers is Professor Nick Cheeseman. And Nick has done wonderful, amazing thesis on law enforcement. And this is groundbreaking, and we have to study a lot from that. He is a fellow and lecturer from the ANU, Australian National University, and he studied the politics of courts and law in Myanmar. And he's also did the research of political order and atrocity and torture. Nick, without further ado, please share us with your knowledge and wisdom. Thank you.
Dr. Kin Mamachi, thank you very much for that kind introduction and for this invitation. And thank you also to colleagues at the Danish Institute for International Studies for hosting this event in very difficult times for all of our friends and colleagues in Myanmar, and for all of us indeed who have been working on Myanmar for many years. So at the outset, I'd like to acknowledge the intensity of the struggle and the sacrifices that our colleagues and friends in Myanmar have been making over these past few months, and in particular to acknowledge those who have lost their lives in the struggle against the military coup of the 1st of February. I've been asked to speak to the topic of the military use of law, present and past, and indeed Kin Mamaji already began to get us into that topic. What I would like to try and do is speak to the topic in two parts very briefly. First of all, to the term use of law, attend to that term itself, and then secondarily to go to the military use of law, past and present, and perhaps also future in Myanmar. And the reason that I want to start just with the terminology of the use of law is to clarify at the outset why that is an apt usage for our discussion of how law is working at the current moment in Myanmar, and also why it's not a condition of lawlessness as it's sometimes characterized as. Indeed, to the contrary, the situation in Myanmar today is saturated by the use of law. The relationship between law and violence that we see on the streets of Myanmar, and then also performed through courts and other institutions, is extensive, and it has a deep history that I'm going to speak to briefly before going then to some of the current conditions, and I hope that that will then open up the part of the discussion that my colleague, Professor Melissa Crouch, will address on the current situation of the practices in the courts in Myanmar presently. So the terminology of the use of law, as I said already, is apt and important for us because use emphasizes how law is being thought of, approached and understood in instrumental terms in the way that we are speaking of it in Myanmar, but also the way in which it's being understood and practiced in Myanmar today. That there is a specific instrumentality to law, and that specific instrumentality goes to the utilitarian philosophical basis for the law as it exists in Myanmar today. Now, that utilitarian tradition comes, as Dr. Kin Mamachi mentioned a moment ago, from the British colonial traditions. Those British colonial practices in the 19th and 20th century and the institutions that were built in Myanmar were not, to be clear, those of the common law, but rather those of a notion of positive law emerging out of the ideas of Jeremy Bentham and others that were prominent thinkers for the British colonizers in India and then in Burma in the 19th centuries. So when we're talking about the use of law in Myanmar today, we need to understand that this is law in the sense of, in Burmese, ubade, positive law, rather than in the sense of substantive law, diyar, a notion of law in Burmese that goes beyond the conceptions of law on the page. This is law as it is written on the page, black letter law, if you will, that we're referring to and thinking about. And it is law in that sense also in as much as it pertains not only to the contents of specific pieces of what may be termed laws and legislation, but a whole host of other instruments, regulations, rules, procedures, all of which carry different kinds of weight in the Myanmar legal arrangements today from those that they might in other contemporaneous settings. In any case, the important point to note here is that this is positive law, which is being used quite precisely to beat down wrongdoers. And that is not in any way coincidental that that's how it's being used in the current moment. That's precisely how it was designed. The colonial program for the introduction of positive law and its use in the 19th and 20th centuries was oriented specifically towards the problem of public disorder and how to prevent it. So inasmuch as we see the persistence of colonial era laws like the Penal Code and its appendages in the present day, this is not at all surprising or accidental. This is precisely the logic of that positivistic legal arrangement carrying over into the current moment. And indeed, I would argue that in many respects, certainly not all of them, but in many respects, the military use of law in the current period is consistent with the logic of the colonial occupiers of previous times. And that is to say that the way in which law is being used in Myanmar today is not despite the manner in which law was introduced in the British colonial period, but because of it. And I think that's important to stress because there's a certain mythology, if you will, among some people who study or talk about Myanmar, and indeed among Myanmar lawyers themselves, that there was some kind of common law conception in which the arrangements of law were grounded in the first part of the 20th century, especially, and that as a consequence of the military takeover, that though all of those qualities of law that existed as a result of the colonial arrangements were eviscerated. In fact, that's not the case. In fact, the logic of colonial law is what we encounter today. It is not despite what the British did, but because of them that Myanmar laws are being used the way that they're being used today. So that brings me then to some brief remarks, comparative remarks on the military use of law, past and present and possibly future. Now, inasmuch as we're talking about the military use of law at this particular moment, I understand it to pertain specifically to questions of large-scale uprisings from the military's point of view, public disorder, past and present, and therefore for our purposes, I think we're talking about comparison of military use of law past and present in relation to uprisings in 1974, the labor strikes of 1974, and the Uitland uprising at the end of that year. The uprising in 1988 that brought Daw Aung San Suu Kyi and her National League for Democracy to prominence. The relatively small uprising, the monk-led uprising of 2007, and this year, 2021. So in total, 4 different events, 74, 88, 2007, and 2021. Let me say something very briefly about the parts that courts, laws, and trials have played in each of these periods, and then pass the discussion over to the next panelist. With regards to the use of courts in these respective periods, there are some interesting similarities and differences. One thing that we see is the important role that the civilian courts have played in all of these occasions, 74, 88, 07, and 2021. However, there's an important difference between the way that the courts are being used, the civilian courts are being used this time around and in 2007 compared to the previous occasions. And that's that in 1974 and 1988, there were major structural changes to the way that courts were working in those years. So there were special difficulties in responding to the public disorder through the civilian courts because the civilian courts were not well prepared, if you will, for the situation. That is not at all the case in 2021. These courts have been very much a part of the arrangements for military control for many decades. And I would argue that the 2010s have not made any significant difference to that. On the contrary, what we saw for the most part in the 2010s was the persistence of the use of courts doing the kinds of things that they were doing under the military in earlier periods. Then alongside those, we see in 2021 the use of military tribunals, including to sentence people to death, as Dr. Kinmamachi mentioned a moment ago. Those military tribunals were not used in 2007, but they were used in 1974 and 1988. So the use of military tribunals to try certain categories of offences in martial law settings is not at all unusual. And the return of them in 2021, although after a long period of time, nevertheless is consistent with the way that courts were used previously. We could speak more about the way that special courts are set up to try certain categories of cases, and that there are closed courts in Burmese, but perhaps could leave that for the Q&A if anyone is interested to go into that. The laws, as I mentioned already, we see the constancy of the penal code over all of these periods, and the use of the penal code in responding to public disorder, precisely because its logics are such that they're intended to address exactly this kind of situation. In earlier periods, it was coupled with different kinds of laws, and I don't have time to go into them, but again, could speak to them subsequently if anyone is interested to do. The important thing to note in 2021, in contrast to previous periods, and Dr. Kinmamachi mentioned it a moment ago, is that we have these quite unusual changes to the penal code, such that there's the introduction of a whole new series of political offences and the introduction of a new 505 section. That's 505 capital A or 505 gachi in Burmese. And that is quite unusual development. In previous occasions, the military junta and indeed its predecessors were satisfied to use the extant penal code precisely because it had been designed already to address pretty much any eventuality of the sort that we're encountering today. The other thing to note is that not only were those changes introduced, but of course they've been used. So the use of 505 capital A as a charge being brought against innumerable people for the, in particular for their Facebook posts, among other things, is a distinctive characteristic, something that we see this time around that I think is quite different from previous occasions. Although previously other kinds of sections which had relatively low penalties attached to them were used, nevertheless, I think that this is something to watch in the current moment, which is somewhat different. In terms of the trials and sentences, it's somewhat too early to say exactly what is going to unfold. There are clearly different temporalities with the ways that trials are proceeding presently as they were on previous occasions. Some trials proceeding extremely quickly and others languishing in the courts with many postponements and taking very long periods of time. Sometimes there are flurries of cases which are moved quickly through the courts, and other times there appear to be delays, long lags in the processing of cases. This is consistent with what we see in 2007 as well, although it's hard to say precisely what the reasons are for the progress of different cases. To close then, one additional comment and one question, I suppose, arising for the panel. The additional observation relates to clemency or to amnesty. That is whether or not, in moving from past and present to the future, whether or not the current military dictatorship will use amnesties widely and frequently as its predecessors had done to release people before the completion of their sentences. So we may see, for instance, many people who are convicted under 505 capital A, but they don't serve the full period that they've been sentenced for, which in the most part will be the maximum period, but they're released after a relatively short period of time. This military dictatorship already in April had one announcement of clemency, mostly for ordinary criminal detainees, but it could subsequently also use that instrument in order to release many people who have been convicted as a result of their participation in protests. The question I have arising for the panel, I think, goes to one other thing which is novel in this current moment, and that's the emergence of the urban-based insurgency, the guerrilla tactics, the assassinations, the bombings which are occurring daily, even though they're not part of the international news anymore. To my knowledge, and perhaps other panelists could correct me if this is incorrect, but to my knowledge, so far no judge or prosecutor has been targeted for assassination or by way of a bombing or otherwise. What happens if judges and prosecutors or courts also become targets for actions by the guerrilla-based, the urban-based guerrilla insurgency? It seems to me that they are very vulnerable targets, and that there may be good reasons for people among those who are carrying out the attacks presently to choose to target judges or prosecutors. What changes might we see to the way that law is being used in Myanmar in that event? I'll stop here and look forward to the rest of the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Thank you, Nick, for a timely and very constructive talk. And it is not surprising that the military has used and weaponized to maximize the law. And actually, you can hear one word repeatedly. The military announcing in their own TV channel that in accordance with law, we are doing that. In accordance with law, we are punishing that. So that is a kind of manual for them in accordance with law. So I'd like to invite another speaker, Professor Melissa Crouch. She is Associate Dean of the Faculty of the Law and Justice at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. Her research has been wonderful, working on law and religion. But currently, she's working on constitutional change in the case of region of Myanmar. We are delighted that you are able to join with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kimamaji, and thank you to DIIS and Oxford for organising this event. And like Nick, I want to echo, I guess, the challenges of today, and we think of people in Mandalay in particular at the moment. Just as I share my screen, I first wanted to clarify that in talking about the courts today, I'm not referring to any one judge or court, because I recognize the risks and sensitivities at the moment in doing that. Okay, so I want to talk about judicial loyalty. So my question is about the CDM movement to some extent. What can we expect from the judiciary? How strong or weak might the CDM movement be within the courts? Before the coup, I started a paper and a data set looking at judicial profiles. And my question was, when would military influence on the courts end? Now, there's a whole range of ways you could think of that. If we thought of it narrowly as when would the Chief Justice, who is a former military officer of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, when would he retire? He will retire in 2028. So we would still have 7 years to wait, even if we weren't in a coup situation. Given the coup, I think there's a wider question, as Nick has alluded to, which is what is the relationship between the judiciary and the military? And how can we think of this relationally? Are the courts perceived to be loyal to the military? Now, in talking today, I want to focus on the Supreme Court and High Courts. And the only reason for doing so is because there was available data on that. So I'm not referring to other courts today. And why does this matter? Well, in areas where there are no military tribunals, so where there is not martial law having been declared, people who are being arrested and detained on various charges will presumably, potentially be heard in the general courts, which at some point in time might include the High Courts or Supreme Court. So before I come to the slide, let me just say something about the context. Many of you will be aware that since the coup, there have been changes in personnel in the Supreme Court, the High Courts, and the Constitutional Tribunal. In addition, we've seen in the newspapers that awards have been given to court staff who have returned to work. Like any government office in Myanmar, there have, of course, been instances in the past of military transfers into the judiciary. And we can think back to 2015 when there was a yellow ribbon campaign where people were protesting the fact that there had been military transfers into the judiciary, or potentially were. So that's some of the context in which we find ourselves today. Let me come now to thinking about 2011 to now and how court personnel have changed or not changed. And that's what this slide is intended to try and think through. And I'd be really interested in comments and feedback on this. So I'm thinking about perceptions of judicial military relations. By that, I mean, obviously, we simply cannot say exactly where the loyalty of an individual judge lies, but we can perhaps make some assumptions based on things that we know. And in the left column, I've focused on who the judge was appointed by. So were they appointed directly by the military? Were they appointed by a military-backed civilian, so I'm thinking of Thein Sein, who was formerly of the military, or were they appointed by a civilian government, namely the NLD? That's one point of difference. The other horizontally is what the background of the judge was prior to being appointed either to the High Court or the Supreme Court. So we have some who were military officers and then were appointed into the civilian courts. Some who were civil servants under military rule and often served for 15, 20, 25 years, 30 years before being appointed to these positions. So effectively served under a military regime. Others were civilian appointees. So these are people who had no prior experience in the civil service or working under a military regime. And usually these are lawyers who were appointed by the NLD. So from those, I want to suggest there are possibly 4 ideal types, if you like, in a Weberian sense, of judges in terms of their possible relations to the military. So one is military loyalists, and here I'm thinking of those who are former military officers and who were appointed by the military or military-backed politicians. The second are military affiliates. So these are people who were civil servants. They weren't military officers, but nevertheless, they served extended periods under military rule. And then the other 2 categories are civilian affiliates who were appointed by the NLD, but who served under the military. So there's a question there as to where their loyalty lies. And then civilian loyalists who, in terms of perceptions, would perhaps perceive to be loyal to the NLD or to a civilian government because they have no prior military service. So from that, you can kind of think of it as a spectrum, with the sort of closest loyalty to the military being these military loyalists, particularly the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is the main example. And then on the other hand, you have civilian loyalists. And these only came into the judiciary because of changes to the appointment rules and because of the NLD government. And there's very few of them. There are some civilian affiliates, and I'll talk a bit about how many in a moment, so we get a sense of how the courts have changed. So very broadly, the Supreme Court. You can see the 3 sort of regimes here, if you like. I've characterized the Thein Sein period as one in which the Supreme Court was staffed by military loyalists or military affiliates. The difference with the NLD period is that the Supreme Court was divided. The NLD was able to appoint 5 of the 10 judges by the end of their term. Now, of course, it was still a military Chief Justice, or former military Chief Justice, but nevertheless, there was a split in the court, a clear split. And then we come to post-coup, and what we find is that the military has removed 3 of the NLD appointees, although one of them does remain, and then they have appointed their own appointments, all of whom worked formerly under various previous regimes. So in many sense, we're back to where we were in 2011. The High Courts, just to say, there is a bit of a uniform profile of a judge of the High Courts. Most are Burman Buddhist, most are men, although about 30 or 40% are women, and most are career judges. So these are people who have spent their entire lives working first as judicial officers and then as judges. And most were educated between 1980 and 1988. So from that education profile, you can have a sense of what kind of education or ideas they might come with to their job. Again, you can see some similarities with the Supreme Court. So the USDP period being military loyalist or affiliates court. The NLD period was slightly different. So the NLD did, because of the age of retirement and the different rules with appointment, they actually appointed about 50% or just over 50% of the High Court judges. So they did have quite a number of them who had been appointed by the NLD, although actually only 3 were civilian loyalists. That is, they were lawyers who had never worked in the judiciary. And then coming to post-coup, again, the military has made new appointments and changes. And so again, the balance appears to have shifted back to being military loyalist affiliates. So just to say some concluding remarks on that. One, I think, is that the demilitarization of this general court system never occurred post-2011. In the 2016 to 2021 period, there were some changes due to retirements and new NLD appointments, but in fact, the majority had still worked in the judiciary under military rule, although they had been appointed, a majority had been appointed by the NLD. Since the coup, we have seen the military reassert its power and influence over the court through about 20 new appointments to the Supreme Court and High Courts collectively. And I think that gives us some indication that, at least from the military's perspective, they had seen those NLD appointees as a potential source of disloyal opposition. And so the reason for replacing them was precisely to put in people who they know would be loyal to them. Now, of course, all of this was based on an idea, I said, which is that it was about perception, and really it was about at the time of appointment. Obviously, people's loyalties change, and for a whole range of reasons. The other challenge, I guess, is that across all three of these eras, we've had the same Chief Justice who is from the military, and that leadership aspect, I think, is important. So just to conclude by saying that if the courts are ever to play a role in taking the country in a different direction, in a democratization or re-democratization, it would first need to engage in a process of demilitarization. And I hope this gives some context as to cases that might be heard by these courts now and what we might expect from the judges in them. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Wonderful, and it's really clear, make us clearly see the thing into context. And it is the major problem that the law and justice system have to go under the military, right? Like, so there is a military continuous use of what does it mean law to that. And like, for example, rape cases, even military rape, they have to go to under the military. So the justice system. So now, I'd like to invite the next speaker, and Helena has been wonderfully working behind the scenes and with a lot of academic anthropologists in particular in Myanmar. And she's a senior researcher and head of the research unit at DIIS, the Danish Institute for International Studies, and she is fellow anthropologist and done many years in Myanmar, particularly on everyday justice, policing, and local dispute resolution. And she published her book, The Everyday Justice in Myanmar, in last year. It is a book that we need to read. And she is also collaborating research with in Myanmar on justice and security together with MRAF and Rangoon University and then other universities, and plus underlying so many researchers in Myanmar. And please welcome with the Helena audience. Thank you. And you need a speaker. Speaker is unmute, please.
Now I think it's working. Sorry for that. Thank you so much for your kind introduction. And like Nick and Melissa, I also want to share my grief and support for people in Myanmar who's facing the situation right now. It's difficult for us who have our hearts and also our strong work relations in Myanmar to follow what's going on. And of course, today we are particularly holding our breath for what's going on in Mandalay. So I'm going to be talking not about the justice system or everyday justice, which is difficult to follow right now on the ground, but on a brief study that we did on police defections that have happened since the coup, police joining the civil disobedience movement, and also about the quiet or subtle forms of defiance by police officers who've actually remained within the force, but who do not necessarily support the military junta. And this study we did, I did together with a Myanmar colleague who unfortunately must remain anonymous due to the current security situation. We based it both on social media, police officers who came forward, but also on a small selection of interviews that were possible with people within the police and wives of police who were close connection to the researcher that I've been working with, because obviously it's risky at the moment to participate in this kind of research. So we were curious about what motivated these defections, but what could also be the obstacles to more police defecting as part of this wider debate about what could be the potential splits within the security forces, part of a debate that has been going on whether that could also perhaps be part of turning the situation of making the military junta crumble in the current situation. That was also part of our interest. So I will highlight a few insights in this paper in this very brief presentation, and of course there will be space if you have questions for more details. You're welcome to write those in the Q&A. So it's undeniable that the military, that the Myanmar police force, the MPF, has been heavily participating in the military junta's control of protesters, in the violent crackdowns, and also intimidations of civilians since the coup. And we've also learned and seen on social media, us sitting abroad and people in Myanmar have seen that police officers have participated in these random beatings, shootings, extortions of money from bypassing vehicles, looting of houses, street shops, and entering into private houses without warrants that have been increasingly happening since the February 1st coup. And in some areas of Yangon, the police have, together with soldiers, also been part of occupying neighborhoods, schools, administrative offices, even hospitals, and so forth. So unsurprisingly, these practices of the police have overall created an atmosphere of huge anger and resentment towards police officers within the ordinary population. And this anger has also been vividly expressed on the social media and in what has been referred to as a social punishment campaign, which has also targeted soldiers along with police officers, where people are encouraged not to engage with, not to sell products to police officers, even if they wanted to buy juice or coconut milk in small street stalls, and also not to buy from the businesses of police officers. And most recently, as was mentioned earlier, the police have also been targets of the increasingly violent resistance, both from the People's Defense Forces and from other parts of the resistance movement. For instance, one police officer just the other day was shot in the head after he had checked a vehicle and smashed the window. And a couple of days ago, we also saw a police vehicle being the target of bombings in Yangon, and we've heard police stations also being targets of attacks in Kachin State and other places. Overall, these roles of the police and the reactions that it's creating in the population is confirming to the people that the police are under the strict command of the army, as a kind of the extended arm of the army, as a reserve of the army in the kinds of situations that we are seeing now. So much like the justice system, this is something that has been institutionalized historically. The police also under the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi government were under the Ministry of Home Affairs, so it has been under the army historically. And it's also understood widely in the population and also through the research that has been done on the police, that the police are also very much subjected to the military doctrine that is part of trainings, where not only criminals but anyone going against the military or expressing critical political views are viewed as enemies of the state. And this is a doctrine that is nurtured in the police trainings, but also apparently, as what we've heard from interviews, during the everyday monitoring of police. But as I come back to, there are perhaps also some exceptions to this. So there's another side to the story, that of defiant police officers who apparently do not stringently follow or are necessarily loyal to the army's commands and its doctrine. And since the February 1st coup, this actually became evident already a few days later, after the first demonstration started. It was on the 9th of February that we saw the first police officers begin to openly join the CDM. We saw some stepping in to protect protesters against being hit by water cannons. We saw some police on the barricades, breaking down the barricades and going over to the protester side. We also saw on the same day, on 9th of February, a police lieutenant in Naypyidaw even going up publicly, making a speech calling for, and I quote him, the fall of the dictator Myanmar line, and also stating his commitment to democracy. And a day later, on 10th of February, we saw no less than 49 police officers in Loyalists in Kayar state joining the protesters, holding placards saying we don't want dictatorship. Importantly, when we look at it, these first defections actually took place before the shootings and killings of protesters by the military junta's security forces. And it also took place a couple of days after we saw circulating on social media people, protesters on the street, trying to get the police over on that side. They were handing red roses to the police, cigarettes, water, and other snacks to them behind the barricades. So there was kind of a moment there of seeing the police coming together with the people in a moment where the violence had still not escalated. But these appeals to the police have stopped since the violent crackdowns escalated, especially since the middle of February. But at the same time, we've also seen more police join the CDM defecting. So by March, what we've heard is about approximately 600 police officers had defected, and now the number that is circulating, that of course is completely unsure, is about 800 police officers. We know that these are hiding from place to place. Some have also been caught by the security forces. Some have gone to India, and we know that some are hiding in ethnic armed organization areas, for instance, with the Karen National Union. So the number is arguably very low in a force that approximately counts around 80,000 members, according to researchers like Andrew Self. But it does signal a deepest dissatisfaction within the force, which was also confirmed in the interviews, small sample of interviews, arguably that we were able to do with some police officers who are still within the force, but who for various reasons, as I will return to, were not able to defect or feared to defect. So those who defected, why did they defect? So some of the first that came out, it was quite clear that it had also to do with very much with political views of not supporting a military takeover of power, of supporting the NLD, of being against a return to military rule. But since then, if we listen to the voices that have come forth and the interviews, most of the defectors focus on a disagreement with the violence against civilians, with the violent crackdowns, and what some of them have also called unlawful orders of the junta. So one of the officers, for instance, who has come forth, he has served 31 years in the force and has also been under the previous military regimes. He said that he did not defect in the beginning because of the military taking over power, but he defected when he saw the extreme violent crackdowns on civilians, and it became too much for him. And I think this was very much related to the Armed Forces Day and the high number of people who were killed during that time. So who defected? I just mentioned there was an officer who had served for 31 years, but arguably most of the defectors that we've heard from are younger and of lower rank, and therefore also from the Generation Z that we have heard so much about, who grew up under the democratic opening. But we do have some higher ranks who have defected, and as I mentioned, some that have served 20 to 35 years in the police force, who have come forth and who have also been a strong source of inspiration and trying also to encourage other police officers to defect. But what unites these, and this is something that we found quite interesting, even though it might not be so surprising, is that the defectors seem to only come from what we would call the civilian branches of the police. And this means that we're talking about police officers who on a daily basis are accustomed to work among the public, are focused on crime control and everyday security. And many of these have also over the past 10 years, despite still being subject to military training, have received some form of training in democratic policing models like community policing, and have therefore not only been sort of under this military doctrinarian form of training, but also the character of the work means that they have closer social relationships, social ties with local communities. They also have relatives and friends who participate in the civil disobedience movement and in the protests. They are less isolated also when we compare it to, for instance, the army. And this was also confirmed among those we spoke with, we interviewed, who have not been able to defect, but who were very keen to defect and who remained within the force, that they were also from the civilian branches. And the way the tactics that they used and the arguments that they used in trying to defy participating in violent crackdowns was very much that it was their relationship to the local communities. It was their connections there. They would warn protesters, they would warn civil disobedience movement participants where they should protest the next day, at what time, to avoid having to confront the police violently. And a very strong discourse, both amongst the defectors that we have seen coming forth on social media and amongst these interviewees that we had, is that it's not the civilian police who have been at the forefront of the violent crackdowns, the civilian branches. It has been the riot and counterterrorism police. So there's a strong discourse within the police, of course, also in the way that they speak about themselves and against the violence, but to kind of like compartmentalize the police into these different branches. It's not the civilian branches doing the violence, but it is these special forces. And the evidence they bring out to kind of support that argument is that they say that a lot of the civilian branches police have been told to remain within the stations, while these units have been transported in from the outside to the cities, but also to some of the rural areas. And another thing that they are highlighting is that the uniform is different. Some were even suspecting that soldiers had been given police uniforms at some point during the violent crackdowns. So we also spoke to people about what are actually the core obstacles to more defectors joining the civil disobedience movement, leaving the force, as we spoke with people who were not supportive of the military junta, who were not supportive of the violence. And the main argument that came forth was of course the fear of being prosecuted, because they fear that they will not only be facing a court case for defecting the police, but also torture. But a very, very strong argument was also the fear of what could happen to the family members. And as some of you participating today might very well know, in a lot of situations, family members of police stay inside the police compounds. So if defectors are not able to bring also the families with them, the biggest fear would be what would happen to the family members, including family members who are not living in the compound. The other fear, of course, was the loss of livelihood, but it was by far the fear of what could happen to families that stood out. Another thing that came forth as an obstacle to defection was the kind of uncertainty and distrust that existed in the police station compounds. People were not really sure of where the political views were, if some people were supporting the military junta or if they were supporting the NLD. So some of the wives that the researchers spoke with, my co-author in this piece, were saying that they didn't dare speak up, they didn't dare really interact with the others at the compound. So that kind of uncertainty about what side the police officers were on were quite strong in terms of also the fears of defecting and telling on each other. So based on these preliminary findings, it's of course completely impossible for us to say anything about how many would be willing to defect if they actually had the option, if somehow these fears and were temperate and the conditions were there. But some of the things that were highlighted in motivating more defections would, of course, as I mentioned before, be a key would be protection not only of the officers themselves, but also their family members. Another would be secure livelihood and housing, both in the short term, safe houses, places to go and get protection. We heard some officers have already fled to India and to the border areas. And then the third thing is also some kind of guarantee for future positions. Where would they go? What would they join? And a lot of those who have come forth, including those soldiers who have been defecting now also, is that they are also appealing to the resistance movement, to the national unity government and other bodies within the resistance to be able to give some kind of guarantee, some kind of vision about where people from the security forces would be able to go in a future scenario. And one of the things in the current moment that could prove really significant to motivate defections and to temper the fears of those who really are against what's going on is also the attitude, the signals that are sent out from people in the resistance movement, from the civilians in general. Because at the moment, there's a hatred, there's a resentment, which is completely understandable. But if there is a way to sort of make police officers, and this also goes for soldiers, to feel welcome, to feel that if they defect, even if they have at some point participated in the violent crackdowns, that would also be a strongly motivating factor, according to people who have stood forth from the police and according to the interviews that we have been conducting. Because the police are, as the title of the paper that we have published, is really that they are standing in this ambiguous position between fear of defecting on the one hand, fear of the social punishment or the ostracism that they're feeling in the population, and then of course the fear of also what's going to happen in a very uncertain future. So just to conclude, I think what our study has shown, trying to understand this field of policing, is, as Andrew Self has also argued in a recent piece, is that it's important to approach the police, and I think we can argue something similar about the army, not as a homogeneous group or entity, but as a very diverse set of actors with different political views, different experiences, but also with different layers of social relations and connections to the communities that they serve and work in. And then we also have to go in and look at the different rank level and the different branches of the police when we are trying to understand both the practices of the police, how they are following the demands and orders of the army, but also in what could motivate defections or more mass-scale defections than we've seen already. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Helena. And then talking about on the ground and the reflection of what is going on the ground, and then making us to think things into perspective. Now, I'd like to invite you our final speaker, Nyat Tisa. She is the founder of the very important research organization in Myanmar, the Untitled Myanmar Research Foundation, MRAF. And she's also very passionate researcher, working so long, working on the injustice program and marginalized people, for marginalized people such as Rohingyas. So, and also she has done so many research. One of them is working with art research. I knew to did that, and she actually collaborate with international artists, human rights activists, journalists, and musicians, researchers. So this is also very important research for discourses in Myanmar. And now I'd like to invite Nyata, and thank you for joining with us. And she is also from Mandalay. And the Mandalay today, as many of you know, Mandalay today has a better ground. So thank you in all of us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mamaji, and DIIS to host this very important panel. Today, I would like to talk about how issues of justice failures is to do with the coup, how addressing these justice failures, long-term justice failures, will be in support of bringing victory against junta, and how the people in Myanmar currently are addressing these justice issues in our everyday resistance against junta. Next slide, please. Now I will start with how the recent coup is largely attributable to these justice failures done by the majority people in Myanmar to the ethnic and religious minorities. The justice failures I mean here is that the deprivation of equality and self-determination by the majority Burma Buddhist groups to minority ethnic and religious groups. And we also have to, of course, include the marginalization of larger and more powerful ethnic groups towards smaller ethnic minority groups. It is true that this long-term institutionalized discriminations and oppressions has been committed mainly by different dictators as part their agenda of sustaining and strengthening their power. However, the majority hegemonic complex sorry, I'm interrupted. Yeah, I will continue. Yes, it is true that this long-term institutionalized discrimination and oppression have been committed mainly by different dictators as part of the agenda of sustaining and strengthening their power. However, the majority hegemonic complexion of Burma Buddhists, seen as this is our land, our race, and our religions by this majority Burma Buddhists have been useful grounds on which dictators built their power through populist political tactics and authoritarian construction of exclusive knowledge, which we can see in terms of public education and state media, and thus reproducing everyday forms of majoritarian dictatorship in the country. Actually, this systemic state and societal dictatorship finally render the culture of dominance by powerful groups whose power comes from the majority power, arms, and wealth, and the domination of those elements, and the combination of all those elements, and those with the lack of those power elements have been living under the fear and oppression for many years. This is how Myanmar society have been suffered and suffer the consequences of the failures of justice. Next slide, please. Now I will talk about why it is very important to address these justice failures to eliminate dictatorship. Despite the prolonged justice failures of reproducing this prolonged justice failures and reproducing of this injustice, the people of Myanmar were significantly benefited from the 10 years of political liberalizations from 2010 to 2020, which provides the people, particularly the members of civil society organizations, with the chance to learn about these failures of justice through close communications with different groups of ethnic people and international community. In other words, within this 10 years of political liberalization, people had a good chance to voice out and to learn about through communications and exchanges with different groups and knowledge development works. Because of this knowledge came from this communications and the voice out, the civil society member became well aware that the issue of long-term justice failure is the fundamental source of all sorts of dictatorships, which again born military dictatorship, and that in order to beat military dictatorship, we have to eliminate the culture of dominance by power. And power means empower, majority power, and the economic power, and the combination of all sources of these corrupted powers. And next slide, please. Now, I will go on how the people in Myanmar are addressing these prolonged justice issues in their everyday resistance against junta. the civil society in Myanmar bring this concept of addressing the justice failures to the wider public in their fight against military dictatorship. This movement of addressing justice failures in Myanmar by members of civil society as a means of fighting against military junta are happening mainly in two ways. The first one is the public movements in terms of strike and media campaigns. And the second one is the civil society members' promotions of federal democratic agenda and abolishments of discriminatory laws in the works of mainstream political actors that mainly CRPH and now National Unity Government. Next slide, please. I think we have to go another slides.
Before or after?
After.
Another one forward.
Yeah, another one forward, please.
Is this the one?
Not really.
I'll just try to go two back.
Oh, yes.
This one, great, thank
No, another one. Yeah, sorry.
Before or after next one?
Next one, please.
After.
Yes, this one. Yes.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And now I will explain about how these movements of addressing justice failures are happening in terms of the public movements. Sorry. Yes. First, it is happened in the forms of the slogans of the strikes. In the strikes led by Myanmar civil societies, purposefully made a call for fighting against dictatorship and building federal democracy, not just fighting against military dictatorship. Equally important call is by Burma youth demonstrators call to apologize ethnic minorities, including Rohingya people, for their failures to respond to the violence and various human rights violations committed by Myanmar armies and Myanmar government against ethnic minorities. For people, for example, a group of medical students urged their fellows and senior medical students to apologize Rohingya people as they made a public denounce against Rohingya people in 2017 and 2016, when Rohingya people were accused of making violence against Rakhine Buddhists and Hindu. Despite that, many Rohingya people at that time were significantly and massively killed and oppressed by Myanmar army, which could even be considered as genocide. In addition to the call in the strikes out on the streets, the CSOs, especially youths, waged a media campaign to bring justice for ethnic minorities. Next slide, please. I would like to show how this is happening. Yeah, in this photo, it reads, we apologize all oppressed from Kachin people to Rohingya people. No? This is how people, especially youth, try to bring transitional justice for the oppressed ethnic minorities in their resistance against junta, no? And next slide, please. And this is a media campaign by youths. It is called Black for Rohingyas, meaning wearing black suits for commemorations of the oppressions of long-term oppressions of Rohingya people. So this is how bringing justice, social justice, transitional justice have been taken place in terms of mass movements, no, in Myanmar. And now next slide, please. Yes. Now I would like to elaborate more on the civil society members' promotions of federal democratic agenda and abolishment of discriminatory laws in order to address long-term justice failures as a means of eliminations of military dictatorship. No? Myanmar civil societies, in conjunction with some of the ethnic and revolutionary groups and ethnic political parties, are pushing the agenda of building true federal democracy in order to bring equality and self-determination for ethnic minorities, as this will address long-term justice failures suffered by the ethnic minority. CRPH, the committee representing Union Pluto, formed in early February with mainly with the members of parliaments from NLD party who won 2020 elections, have been making efforts of countering military junta by forming a parallel government, by making alliance with ethnic political groups. At this point, Myanmar civil society, which understand well that building true federal democratic state will eliminate the long-term rule of majority ethnic Burma, and this is the cause which will help unite different ethnic people in Myanmar. Push NLD dominant CRPH to agree on federal democratic agenda. In pushing this, the civil society and ethnic political entities are calling for abolishment of 2008 constitution, drafting federal charter, and formation of inclusive multi-stakeholder political dialogue platforms. This push has been resulted now in abolishment of 2008 constitution, development of federal charter and National Unity Consultative Committee, NUCC, and the agreement of the formation of People's Assembly. Both NUCC and People Assembly, that the civil societies and ethnic and revolutionary groups meant are the bodies to give policy guidance to NUG and prepare federal constitution for the union after the elimination of Miao Line's junta. In addition, Myanmar's peoples are advocating, and Myanmar, civil society members are advocating NUG ministers, particularly human rights ministers, on NUG policy statement on Rohingya to bring transitional justice for Rohingya people and abolishment of 1982 citizenship law, which has been used as a discriminatory tool against Muslims and Rohingya people by Myanmar dictator since General Ne Win's government. So in conclusion, what I have presented today is how recent coup and long-term dictatorship in Myanmar is attributable to the injustices committed by majority ethnic Burma on ethnic and religious minority. and how these long-term justice failures have been addressed by Myanmar people, driven by Myanmar societies as part of elimination against military dictatorship. As a final key message of my today's presentation, I would like to tell all Myanmar people that it is very fundamental to bring justice and transitional justice, as well as to base this concept and practice of justice in building future democratic society in order to end a victory against the current neo-alliance-led junta. Integrating justice concept and bringing justice in this revolution against military dictatorship is actually waging a moral warfare against it. And this is very important. This moral warfare against military junta is very significant and important to gain this victory. Next slide, please, final slide. So I have to say that we always have to remember that no justice, no victory. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And today is very important in a way that this seminar highlight failure is not an option, because law has been exploited and manipulated by the military for 7 centuries since independence. And there is anti-law particularly designed by colonialists for foreign country. India still exists, but also customary law, and also adding to unjust law in Myanmar is not working for the society. And really also at the same time, amidst all the tragic, the age of civil war, bloodshed, and I found this is like kind of something enlightenment. It is for the first time in the history of Myanmar. This is an ideology revolution. People are fighting against racism, religious superiority, sexism. So that is not just a protest or revolution based for politics. It is based for humanity and bind the people. So I think this is very much in hope that we can actually focus on, and that's why this revolution failure is not option and time for change. So I like to, here is like a few questions that we have. And the first person that I like to focus on is law students from Myanmar. Here's a question for you all. There are many law students in Myanmar who cannot go to university right now because of the coup, or who are also joining CDM. What can we as law students in Myanmar do to support our countries with our legal fields? So Nick, Melissa, Helena, anyone? A very important question, and you are leading and guiding the Myanmar law student. So no option, no pressure.
Can I seek clarification, Dr. Ma? Do you mean those who are stuck out of the country, or students in Myanmar who have had their education disrupted? In Myanmar,
they study in law, they are law students, but they are also what they can do to do that, to contribute.
Sure, maybe just a plug. I know there are a number of people, and probably some who are on the call here, who are involved with either the Federal University of Myanmar or the Spring University of Myanmar. And I know in coming weeks, there are some discussions around how best to provide some online education experiences. And I think certainly if there are people in students from Myanmar who have ideas on how to do that, feel free to get in touch with anyone from this panel, or have a look on Facebook for those particular groups.
Helena, Nick?
Yeah, no, I agree very much with Melissa that these new alternative initiatives on online teaching and exchanges is incredibly important at the moment to do. if there is courage and energy to also document while you're engaged in CDM, to document what's going on using the education you already have to document some of the injustices that are going on, the ways the law is being used and misused, then I think that would also be very worthwhile. Maybe not something you can publish now, but information gathering on that I think would also be extremely useful.
Anything Nick and Mette want to add? No, yes. Mette?
Actually, I have learned that there are some Myanmar scholars in partnership with international scholars. They are now preparing for this federal university, and there are also others called Spring University, which I learned a little about it. So I think those people who want to join university education, I think this will be partly helpful, but we also have to make significant efforts to deliver this good university educations to most of the university students who want academic freedom, in Myanmar. No?
Okay. And we have like 13 minutes, right? Like a kind of question. So we will not, if we don't have a time, we cannot include comments. We will just ask the questions, okay? So now next question is that, or to the whole panel, what does the panel think about the state of emergency, suspension of many constitutional rights and jurisdiction of the High Court to grant relief in the nature of habeas corpus pursuant to S491 of the Codes of Criminal Procedure? Is it still a viable mechanism to secure the release of unlawfully detained people? And I'm trying to work some of these cases right now, but the state of emergency may be a real obstacle. So anyone who wants to answer? Nick?
I nominate Melissa.
Melissa?
So Dr. Ma, I wonder if I could just respond to another question that Nick put out, or a provocation, I think it was, that wasn't lost on me, which was, would we see the movement at the moment potentially target courts as well as other legal institutions? It just reminded me, I guess, that on the 29th of February, as I understand it, the Supreme Court was barricaded. And at the time, it seemed a little strange. I mean, we'd heard the rumors of the coup, and yet we saw in the newspapers the Supreme Court being barricaded. If you know the Supreme Court, you know that it's 40 kilometers from the center of Naypyidaw. It is the furthest government building, from the center of Naypyidaw, which I have previously suggested gives an indication of how far it is removed from the center of power in Myanmar. But it was barricaded because the military at the time had put a case to the Supreme Court around Quo Warranto. It was questioning the legitimacy of the Union Election Commission to hold office and so on and so on. So it seems strange at the time, but now I think about it, maybe the targeting of judicial institutions has been anticipated by the military far in advance, perhaps, of what we all even expected.
Anybody want to add? Let me move.
No, I was just going to prompt Melissa though on the habeas corpus side, since she's written on this topic. I wrote about this topic many years ago, but I feel like my observations are either outdated, or if I went back to what I wrote previously, I would be in the unfortunate situation of saying, see, I told you so. So that's why I was suggesting that, Melissa, you might be able to speak to the more recent research that you've done on this question.
Sure. I mean, I guess in brief, I think the research I did was still consistent with some of your findings, Nick, but as you say, was in more recent years, which is that obviously there were as far as I'm aware, no successful habeas corpus cases. In part, it was because since 2011, because while there were one or two that I know of cases submitted in the early years post 2011, they were kind of spectacularly unsuccessful, I guess. These were cases where the applicants alleged that the military potentially had the person, and the military said, well, we don't have them. And so the court said, okay. And, it was a huge disappointment and frustration, I think, for lawyers and others. So there were attempts, but they certainly didn't go anywhere. There were other kinds of writs cases, not habeas corpus, but other types of remedies that were successful, but certainly not ones that were against the police or the military. So I think the consistent trend that we had in the use of those kinds of remedies, of which habeas corpus is one, is that while there was some success, there was certainly no success when it came to the police or the military, and certainly very much a closed door on habeas corpus cases in particular. So I think now there's simply no possibility or room at all for any of those kinds of cases.
And thank you. Now this question is for Helena. And what are your views on the extent of which unionization of security staff could be a future project to aim for, and to extent to which an embryonic proto-union movement of sorts could develop into a platform that could work with some of these issues in exile? Something I'm asked by Thomas Martin, something that I consider in my work in prison staff. Thank you, Helena.
Yes, I think that's a very good question. I mean, there's also soldiers who have come, you know that very well, Dr. Kim Mamaji, who have defected, and it is one of the large questions right now also that could motivate more defections if there was some kind of not only a safe place to go, but also a project to work around and to unite around, because a lot of the fears or reluctances to defect is that people, of course, fear their physical security of the family, but also what are the options, what are the alternatives? Is there a place to go and work more deliberately in terms of opposing what's going on with the military coup? So I think, yeah, that would be very worthwhile. How it practically would work out is another question, right? Because I think there's also still a huge lack of trust when police officers and soldiers defect. Who can, well, you know, first of all, whether people can trust them. Are they really defectors, or are they informers? And we've heard that also from some of the defecting soldiers going to, for instance, the EAO areas, that there is that suspicion to begin with. So I think that is a hurdle to be tackled prior to actually doing a project around that. But otherwise, I'm sympathetic. I wanted just to, if I may, because I saw one of the comments in the Q&A from Sunette Herbert about the role of ethnicity in terms of defections, and I do think she's completely right. In some of the defections we've seen, also in Chin State, has elements of ethnicity. We know some of police officers have gone to India also with the help of ethnic minority groups, and the fact that they are themselves either Chin or Naga or from other ethnic groups. But if we look broadly at defectors, I don't think ethnicity is a determining factor, and I think that's one of the things that is so characteristic of the current situation, is that these ethnic boundaries obviously are still there, but they're also breaking down. And Burma police officers and Burma soldiers are also defecting because they you know, their own people and in the cities are also being targeted to an extent that has not been seen before historically. So I think actually the ethnic boundaries in that respect are also breaking down. But thank you for bringing it up as also one factor that plays a role.
Your mic was off. Your mic is off.
Thank you, Nick. We have a roughly 5-6 minutes, and you all see also comments. And is there final comments that do you want to add? Nick.
Maybe I can just pick up on Helena's remarks, and I'm not sure if I can develop a question, but perhaps make a couple more points that could push that discussion on the defectors forward a little bit more, Helena, or rather attend to the distinction precisely that you were making between the township police forces and perhaps those at the next level up in the hierarchy, although I gather predominantly you were making a distinction between the township police stations and the police battalions. At one level, I can see precisely why the situation is, as you say it is. It goes again to the logic of policing in the colonial conditions, and then of course in the post-colony, and that is that policing primarily is not a program of the sort that we associate with the metropolitan police in the European metropoles, but rather a program for the maintenance of law and order, of management of public order. Now, what do local township, nowadays township and previously otherwise designated stations do? Well, they engage in public order problems of a mundane day-to-day nature. Again, they're not working in the manner of metropolitan police, but nevertheless, their problems of public order are routinized problems of public order, public drunkenness, your exposure, your public property damage, this kind of thing. And the presence of a paramilitary police force has been, and was characteristic of the way that the colonial occupier worked. And I think the logic continued in subsequent periods in one form or another, in one institution or another, which is such that you don't always want the military to be present every time that a public order situation of the sort that we see, again, framed the way the military would have it in the last few months emerges. Rather, how can you go about it by introducing some other entity? And that's what these paramilitary battalions presently, and of course their predecessors, the Longtain battalions were doing. So in some senses then there's sort of what you're identifying is just, it's consistent with the logic of this situation, right? A public order situation of this sort is exactly the situation that you have those battalions present for. I think one, if you would like to comment on that, I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about it. But the other thing I wanted to just put in the mix, because it didn't come up in the discussions, partly because we were attending to slightly different topics, was then what are the implications in the current moment and the possibilities for the re-emergence of gangs, of thugs in the manner of course, the Swan Shin in the 2007 uprising, but now apparently the re-emergence of some entity that may be Swan Shin-like, but is going under the nomenclature of Busorti, which, as I've pointed out to anyone who's interested to know, is an audacious title for the institution, and if ever there was one, because the Busorti, of course, existed in the 1950s as a paramilitary entity that was shut down because of the extreme violence and impunity that it used in a number of parts of the country. And so I wonder whether or not in the course of the discussions you've been having with defectors, that's also come up, and if any of other colleagues, panelists or otherwise, have thoughts on the possibility of the part that these groups of thugs may play and implications for their conditions, and how we may think, sorry to add one question on top of another, and how we may think then about the relationship between law and violence in the context in which these nebulous entities such as Swan Shin and Busorti are active.
Melissa, do you want to add something? Final thought and
final thoughts. No, except to say they're good questions, and I look forward to people who are doing research on this more going forward.
Nyate, do you want to add something final?
Yes, actually, now we now know that this junta, Myanmar's junta, will do everything, arbitrarily on the people, right? So we the people, we don't have any laws or justice in our minds. It is, gone, all gone. So now you see how people are struggling, waging armed struggles, no? And we saw a lot of very sadful photos of killings the people, no? And then it happened in Mandalay, no? Yeah. So in Mandalay, and I'm also grown up in Mandalay, and I have a lot of Burma friends in Mandalay. And I would like to tell them that I would like to answer their all conversations. No, they one time told me when we talk about this long-term ethnic conflicts in Myanmar, no, and what they said is, I mean, as long as they wish a war against Myanmar army, then those ethnic areas will not be peaceful. What they said is that at that time I was quite silent, and even though I had some answer, no, but now I showing these photos of killings by the People's Army, then I would like to tell them, I mean, now you have experienced this very violence, no, and then I know that you don't want to stop it, even though you have been very freshly suffered this violence. I know that you don't want to stop your resistance, because I know that we don't have justice. As long as we don't have justice, there will not be peace, and we cannot stop our fight against this junta. Now, my friends, all Burma people, you will now understand that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mette. It's really, really important, and I must support Mette. It is really that now time for justice for all. It is a kind of, that's why we can see why ethnic people are fighting for that long, why they want to sacrifice everything to bring the justice. So that is where we all can actually join to support justice and humanity for Myanmar. And people are fighting, and so far this is the only hope within 70 years that we have. So that is it's real important that we all support. And Helene, do you have a last comment for half second?
I think that the time has gone up. I think the issues that you raise, Nick, are extremely interesting, and I'm also seeing a fragmentary emergence of different kinds of security criminalized actors, resistance actors, and I think we will see that very pluralized landscape shaping up. And I also very much agree with you that we need to look at the police from also the past years of engagement with the population. I mean, we saw that also in our research, police officers also engaging in these forms of local level negotiations and resolutions that had nothing really to do with the official system or the command structures that we have. And I think that's incredibly important to understand that pluralism within the police and the army, and that is also important to understand in terms of seeing a way out and options for these actors to join the resistance in one way or the other. But I do also fear this kind of fragmentation into gangs and groupings, which is not only the case in Myanmar, but in many other places where we have a similar kind of situation. And otherwise, I just want to say thank you to all the people who participated, and thank you to you, Dr. Kinmamaji, and Melissa, Nick, and Miatet, also for your very moving last words just now.
And also, I think there's a kind of this our and thank you to this and Helene and all the speaker. And I like to echo it. This is a Tanaka International is collaboration across all the university, internet, and activists, policymakers, donors to find a solution to help, to prevent bloodshed and humanitarian crisis. So we are working together and inform, educate, engage, empower, and sustain this democratic movement. And but above all, this is about humanitarian issue. And I think as a human being, we all have a responsibility to do that. So Tanaka International is like a kind of platform that working together with everybody and contribute and organized by everybody. So I think this is the only way that we can really engage with the people in Myanmar. And we also help them to learn and engage, so that they would be informed activists and decision maker, and so that they can actually move forward to democratic futures. And again, this is as you all agree, that is a wonderful panel, but and we learned so much, and we need to absorb so many things, making so much question into our mind. But it kind of also, we need to think, what can we do to move forward? How can we engage more with people in Myanmar, for example, right, police, soldiers, and also a student from law firm, they are working on lawyers. So how can we do to help them to move from here to forward? And that would be very good, and a very good advice and very good contribution for us. And time-wise, we are wonderful. We have a 5-minute bus. So we all are okay with that. And I'd like to thank you to everybody. And I'm sure this is the beginning, and we'll have more to discuss with this issue, because this is the most fundamental issue of justice for everybody. Thank you. And thank you, DIIS, for doing wonderfully hosting and making it all available. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
very
you.
much.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye for now.